Now, calling this year's speech our unity budget, Minister Heng outlined the $106 billion financial plan to chart Singapore's future with confidence amid global uncertainty. Now, he cited the coronavirus crisis, geopolitical tensions and economic shifts, amongst others, to have had significant impact on Singaporeans. Now, Minister Heng announced that he will deploy financial resources to 4 different categories, namely to stabilise and support, to transform and grow, to care and for, to nurture and to build and secure our future together. And the government will provide a stabilisation and support package amounting to $4 billion. Now, under it, there will be schemes to help enterprises retain their local workers. The sectors directly affected by COVID-19 will also get additional support, like in the form of property tax rebates and rental waivers. And as part of a $1.6 billion care and support package, all adult Singaporeans will receive up to $300 in a cash payout, and eligible HDB households will receive double the current amount of utilities rebates. Now, for seniors, Budget 2020 will increase retirement support for them by enhancing housing monetisation schemes, introducing a matched retirement savings scheme, and enhancing the Silver Support Scheme. Minister Heng also said that the GST rate increase will not take effect in 2021. It will remain at 7%. The government will provide an assurance package when the GST rate is raised. This will be a $6 billion package for Singaporeans to cushion the increase. And to prepare the country for climate change, a $5 billion coastal and flood protection fund will be set up to protect our coast against rising sea levels. Now, other environmental measures announced earlier today will foster cleaner energy transporting, including the electrical vehicle adoption incentive. Mr. Heng also said that on the whole, he expects an overall budget deficit of $10.9 billion or 2.1% of GDP. And that was a quick wrap of this year's budget speech. It's back to Rachel for a more in-depth discussion. Rachel?
Thanks, Dylan. And in our show today, we'll focus on these 4 issues from the budget speech. Singapore's coronavirus measures, the initiatives that will benefit each individual Singaporean, transforming for our future, and sustainability efforts to combat climate change. And to digest the budget measures announced in these areas, let's bring in our experts once again. Alvin Liew, a senior economist from UOB. Chu Woon Hong, tax partner from KPMG. Dr. Gillian Goh, Deputy Director, NUS Institute of Policy Studies, and Vikram Khanna, Associate Editor of the Straits Times. So thank you all for joining us once again. First, I'd like to ask each of you, perhaps starting with Vikram, what are your thoughts from this year's budget? How would you summarize it, perhaps in 3 words? What are your key takeaways?
3 words. Okay, I mean, there was a hell of a lot to digest. I mean, it's a 2-hour plus budget. But if you give me just 3 words, I would say it's generous. I mean, that's obvious from the size of the deficit. It's comprehensive. And it's at the same time, it's targeted. So so targeted means it attacks the problem that companies are going to face as a result of the coronavirus downturn. It targets which sectors will be affected. But at the same time, it also offers protection to all companies and Singaporeans on a very broad scale. So that's why it's both targeted and comprehensive. And of course, it's generous.
Thank you, Vikram. And we'll go into that a little bit deeper later, but I'll go on to Gillian first. Gillian next. So how would you summarize the budget? What are your 3 key takeaways or 3 words that you would describe?
I think assurance, certainly with respect to the COVID effect, there is the job support scheme that hopefully will make employers keep their employees in place. There's also the assurance that comes from knowing that the GST increase will not happen anytime soon, but money is put aside and the assurance is given that there will be offset measures, and there are details to that. Assurance also for retirees and senior workers, so there's enough there to incentivize putting money aside for retirement, but also to keep seniors in place. So I think assurance is the first key word that I would put in there. The second is inclusive. So you see that there's quite a lot for also people with disabilities, with now the enabling employment scheme, which is a rejig of what used to be the special employment scheme. But also inclusive because there's the our Singapore Fund, which is going to be a lot of money to promote partnerships, government partnerships, because people on the ground will know better how things have to be done in order to include more people. And I think the third word I would give is indeed very specific and targeted. There are very many schemes. So in a way, it may be a bit confounding as to which scheme might fit you. And I don't know whether there will be someone on the ground, a bureaucrat or people to kind of triage the system so that you know as a worker or as a person with disabilities or a senior or a company what you'll be able to tap.
Thanks, Gillian. And perhaps we could go over to Woo Hong, maybe just to briefly summarize, what are your three key topics?
When I was going through and listening to the budget, keywords came to me. It's a very comprehensive budget, assuring like what you said, and definitely everyone is being looked after. Singaporeans, jobs, workers, companies, no one is left out. So it gives us a very assuring feeling that the government is very decisive and know what to do in these very challenging times.
And Alvin, what are your key takeaways?
From the economist's point of view then, something slightly shorter, I hope. There is short term, which is what the COVID was to deal with the COVID, and there's always the long term. And at the end of it, this is an expansionary budget, more expansionary than what we had expected.
Well, thank you. And we'll move over to the first topic of today. So COVID-19, better known as the novel coronavirus, has rippled shockwaves across the globe. So far, there are a total of 77 cases here in Singapore, and Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has said that the impact on the economy already exceeds SARS and that a recession is possible. Businesses, workers and households are all expected to be badly affected by the fallout of the virus. And let's hear more from Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat on measures introduced in this year's budget to support businesses and the economy.
Our foremost concern is jobs. We want to help our workers retain their jobs and use any lull period to upgrade their skills and be ready when the upturn comes. As NTUC Secretary General Ng Chee Meng and his union leaders said, every worker matters. I will therefore provide a stabilization and support package amounting to $4 billion. To help our workers stay employed, I'll support enterprises by defraying their wage costs through two schemes.
Well, the two schemes that Minister mentioned are the Job Support Scheme to provide one-off wage support to help enterprises retain their local workers. This will cost the government $1.3 billion. The second scheme is an enhancement of the wage credit scheme to support wage increases for Singapore workers. These, along with enhanced redeployment programs and cash flow support for enterprises. Now let's turn to our panel of experts to find out their thoughts on the measures. So perhaps, Woo Hong, I can start with you. What are your thoughts on the job support scheme and the enhancement to the wage credit scheme?
Okay. For the job support scheme, it is a one-off wage subsidy support, and it comes at a very timely manner in such a way that it's a very broad-based. Sectors that are affected will be benefited from it. So it's not so targeted, but it's very broad-based. Whereas the wage credit scheme is a bit of looking forward to the future. It defrays the cost of rising wages. So you can see that the government is focusing most on the short term and also not forgetting the long-term wage increase cost that company may face. So it's a very well thought through kind of strategy and plan.
Any comments, Alvin?
Well, if you look at it, the first thought that came to my mind is I compare it with 2009, because this is very similar to the scheme that was announced. But the difference, of course, at that point, right, the face value of it, right, that one was a $4.9 billion, I would call it a bazooka. This one, in this form itself, right, on the wages part, right, is much smaller at $1.3 billion. But I think there is a difference right now, because at that point, right, we were facing a dire consequences with quite significant economic impact. Right now, the time is uncertain. There is economic impact, but it is not to the extent that what we have experienced in 2009, at least not yet. So you can see that the measured portion of the implementation of the measure itself is, to me, I think it's taking out from the old rule book something that to help something that could be a short-term issue. But beyond this, right, if it turns to be something slightly more deadly, slightly more long-term, the virus stays with us in a more malignant manner, right, then I would assume that down the road, I can't deny that there might be a chance of a supplementary budget to face this problem. But right now, I think this is more than enough.
And that's similar to what we saw in SARS as well. It was an out-of-budget measure.
The one that we saw in SARS, pretty much. Yeah.
And Vikram, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the priority here was job protection, to keep employers from retrenching workers. And this is an incentive for them to keep workers on their rolls. It's also a demand-boosting measure. You'll have the workers work longer, they'll have more money to spend, there'll be more demand in the economy. But that said, I'd agree with Alvin that this is a very short-term measure. This is a 3-month program, 3 months, $1.3 billion. And we can't be sure that this coronavirus crisis will not stretch beyond 3 months, and I think we have to ask, then what? The other question I would have is that, okay, I mean, I think employers might be incentivized to keep employees on their rolls, but if the crisis lingers on, I think you could have retrenchments despite the support, because companies have no choice. In that case, I think we have to ask what will come if the crisis lingers. So I think Alvin mentioned that there probably may have to be a supplementary budget, but I think we'll have to keep our eyes open for that possibility, and we hope it doesn't happen. The other striking thing, of course, is that there are a lot of these one-off measures in this budget. So there's the job support is a one-off 3-month thing. There's working capital loans is a 1-year thing. Property tax rebates are 1 year. Then there's corporate tax rebates also 1 year. And even for the workers, like workfare income supplements, so it's also a 1-year sort of increase. So I think the focus is very much that, look, let's concentrate the measures on the short-term problem that we are facing. A lot of these COVID-related measures are short-term focused. So and that makes sense. I mean, that's how, rather than sort of, and it's also cheaper, obviously. I mean, you can't have things that go on forever.
And if we were looking at a longer-term fallout from COVID, I mean, what are some of the other, incentives perhaps you would have liked to have seen from the budget for COVID-19?
The longer incentive will be how to ensure that employers will continue to hire the workers, right? And that is what we can see, that the government is giving out the senior employment credit scheme to retain older workers to work longer, and that is one way to preserve the workforce, and also the courses that they have to attend, to upskill themselves. That will be more long-term focus.
I think just going into more, sector-specific help. So we saw help for tourism, aviation, retail, food services, point-to-point transport. Any sectors that perhaps they might have missed out, or that you would have liked to have added into that?
I think we see this as, for this specific COVID outbreak itself, right? Definitely, right, the sectors that are named, right, are the first in line to get hit. But of course, the problem is how long is this virus going to hang around? If it extends more than the period of, say, 3 months, right, then your secondary other industries are going to get hit. For example, like manufacturing. That means that the problem persists in China. Supply chains are going to be disrupted longer than expected, and therefore manufacturing here is going to be impacted. And then those sectors that are going to be impacted in the longer run, right, it's going to need more help. And we also be mindful that China is a key investor in this area. And if their problem persists and their investments are delayed, right, then somebody has to step in to elevate the situation. We can't have a year where our investment just drop off the cliff and expect it to go back up normal. So there must be some measures. But again, this is all dependent on how persistent and how protracted this outbreak could be. For now, it is seen as, I think from the numbers I look at it, right, based on the budget, right, it looks like the perception is it could be a shorter term problem. They are probably basing it on the length of no longer than SARS.
But SARS was 8 months.
It depends, because SARS for us, we were declared SARS-free somewhere before the middle of the year by WHO. So I technically call that our end of episode for SARS at least.
Yeah, but the SARS crisis itself,
yes,
lasted 8 months. We've only gone 2 months, and I think you're right. I think we have to be concerned also about manufacturing, which, by the way, is already being hit. The supply chains have already been disrupted, and manufacturers in Singapore are already finding shortages of components. I think Business Times ran some stories on that. And when manufacturing gets hit, then it spreads into trade-related services, for example, wholesale trade, and then it becomes a sort of a demand shock, across the economy. So now this is already happening. Then there's also the slowdown in ASEAN, because ASEAN countries are also affected by the same problem. Their supply chains are also affected, and our sales to ASEAN will also go down. So it's not just a China problem, it's also a broader regional problem. So it becomes a little more complicated, much more complicated the longer it goes on.
And so, I mean, moving away from businesses, Gillian, what were your thoughts in terms of the measures and what impact or what the response would be from, I guess, your average Singaporean?
Well, I think if you look at what else is in the care and support package, then for low-wage workers, there's a sort of enhancement of the workfare payment that's helpful. There is a small measure for grocery vouchers. I think that's going to be helpful. The GST vouchers are enhanced, so there's more payout and more support for rebates and service and conservancy charges. But I think really if the impact is longer term and businesses do have to sort of downsize or close, then I think the minister said that workers should take advantage of this time to reskill, to pick up new skills. And so you've seen two boosters to that aspect in terms of the Skills Future framework. One, that there would be a top up to Skills Future, and then there's the second one, which is to facilitate mid-career moves. That's another booster specifically to enhance what's in the Skills Future package for people between 40 and 60 years old. And then incentives for companies to hire them as well. So presumably there might be some pain for different companies, but there'll be other companies that are moving into the industry or wishing to grow. So they'll have quite a lot of help on the worker skilling side and also bringing in new workers to help them grow their companies. And so for the average person, then I think really we're hoping that they will feel a little bit of optimism that if they wanted to switch out to a different industry or sub-industry, they'd take advantage of this help and move.
Now's the time to transform yourself.
Nobody wants to do that, but if you have to, then there is that support, I think. But businesses themselves have to kind of do some heavy lifting themselves, right?
Yeah, well, thanks to our panelists. Let's check in with Dylan. It's time to hear what you've all got to say about the government's measures and to deal with the fallout of the coronavirus outbreak. Dylan, what have you got for us on social media?
Well, thank you, Rachel. Now, well, it's true, I've been keeping my eye on our Facebook and Twitter, as well as our YouTube pages, and the comments and questions are coming in, so do, of course, keep them coming in. Now, we have a couple of interesting ones. Let's pull some of them out. We have the first one from Muhammad Firdaus, who asked, what if the COVID-19 situation lasts for a year, and are these measures actually enough? I think that's a really interesting point over there. Let's bring up another one. We also have Mr. Govind Singh on Facebook, who has a question about the jobs support scheme. How is it different from the jobs credit scheme that was announced in Budget 2009 in response to the 2008 financial crisis? Now, any of our panelists, would you like to, any thoughts about that?
Yeah.
Vikram?
Okay. The first one was, how is this? What happens if it lasts for a year? Will these measures be enough? I think we pretty much decided no, they will not be enough. You will need a supplementary budget or something. The second question: how is this different from the jobs credit scheme in Budget 2009? Well, qualitatively, it was the same in the sense that it was a wage subsidy. Right, but the jobs credit scheme of 2009 was, as I recall, it was bigger. It was bigger. It was not a 3-month scheme. It was a longer scheme, and it was a 12% wage subsidy. This is an 8% wage subsidy. Although the cap for the 2009 scheme was, I think, $2,500, and this is $3,600. So qualitatively the same scheme, but this is of shorter duration, and the percentage is smaller. Percentage of wage subsidy is smaller.
And one key difference was during 2009, there was a request to do a drawdown from reserves in response to the crisis. And it fit the criteria where that was a dire circumstance. So if you use that as a benchmark to currently, there is great uncertainty, but we have not reached the point that it is a dire circumstances, I think, just to paraphrase the word.
So I think it has to be quite an informed response. I think we have 70-some cases. But also the mortality rate is very low outside of Wuhan or Hubei. So we're looking at a 0.2% mortality rate. Of course, every person you lose is terrible. But then, outside of Wuhan, it's much smaller. So I think the key thing is, what is our connection, not to China, but specifically to some of the provinces that are hit, and how does that affect supply chains? And so I think it has to be quite an informed position. So 3 months, might be something that you take right now. Nobody sees this going in a very large scale to a year, I think.
So if this were to persist, right, then our usual normal supply chain has to be relooked at. We should look at other countries.
But it seems to be very kind of specific rather than hugely global.
Supply chains is, to relook at supply chains is much easier said than done. If we look at some of the how supply chains are linked, right, I think there's some simple way of looking at it. I can't remember what's the chart, but China forms like 90% of supply chains currently, or at least for Asia. And if you look at by country basis, if without needing external supplies going into a place, right, I think China is the only one that can produce something without external supplies. So by that measure, right, if China's supply chains are impacted, right, nobody can really replace them in that short order of things.
So I guess the question is Singapore's exposure to that, and specifically to Hubei, rather than all of China, right?
The Hubei is probably an important province, but the lockdown itself has expanded to various key other cities and other places within China itself. So the question mark is whether are we going to see, like in March itself, much of these places, except for maybe Hubei, comes back to regular operations. It's I know we are deviating a bit more from the budget, but this is really a key uncertainty. Putting it at 3 months is probably correct for the better judgment right now. But as we approach to the middle of the year, we probably can see that more needs to be done, or less, depending on the situation.
I think just to take off on that point, I mean, the issue is now what happens when the Chinese workers who had gone home for Chinese New Year
Unable to come back.
able to come back. Okay, at some point they will have to come back. At the moment, there's travel restrictions and quarantines, which are going to some sources like New York Times say affecting more than 700 million people. But at some point, this has to change. The workers have to come back, and what happens then? Do the cases go up? The cases start going up again. You know, now at the moment, the cases seem to be tailing off, at least in Hubei. But when the workers return to normal work and the economy starts moving again, and people are interacting as normal, or what will happen?
I guess that's why the Ministry of Manpower is very specific. You need actually permission. Each company needs to seek permission before it brings in
But you know,
the workers
they have
back
to at
Singapore.
some point, they can't keep denying permission. They have to at some point allow the economy to start moving. So they have to move from a strategy of containment to mitigation. They have to move, and that's a bit of a risk. And the other thing is, of course, it's psychology that matters. I mean, even if the cases, even if the death rate, the fatality rate is low, this thing is very contagious. You know, people are concerned about that, and they restrict their own activities, and that causes a decline in economic activity generally. And this is happening even here. Yeah. You go out, you see restaurants, malls, all. I mean, it doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, but I think we'll bring it back to the budget. I think because of the current situation, I mean, it is extraordinary times, and we could talk for some time about what's happening with COVID-19 for the moment. So we'll check in with Dylan later for more questions and comments. And you know, we've heard the measures that the government is going to roll out to help the economy, businesses, and certain sectors during the COVID-19 crisis.